Hi, I'm Joe Lindsay. Welcome to How's the Form, a podcast for men in, let's say, the second half of life, like myself, over 50.
How's the Form is brought to you by AgeNI and is part of the Good Vibrations Over 50s Men's Health Programme, which is funded by Movember.
My guest this week is our resident mental well-being expert, best-selling author and psychotherapist, Owen O'Kane. Okay, so Owen, I guess my first question, the obvious one, how's the form?
Good, really good actually. Bit busy, very busy at the minute, but in a good way. Some really interesting stuff. Got a load of projects on. I still have clients. So I still work clinically. Starting to work on the next book, and various bits and bobs going on. But it's good, really. I mean, look, this is a privileged platform. All of this stuff I'm doing at the minute, I see as a real privilege. So it's great, and I love what I do. I mean, I think it's always a challenge. If you don't love what you do and you're busy, then I think it can feel like a real hassle. But actually, when you really love what you do, then it does keep you going. It keeps the energy going. So no, I'm good, and I'm happy to be here today. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh no, God, the thanks is all coming from this direction. I mean, you're a best-selling author, psychotherapist, and as you know, what we're doing with this project is talk about the kind of physical and mental health of men, of a certain age, i.e. over 50.
Yeah.
I mean, from what you've seen, what are the main kind of issues that you're seeing with men 50 or over?
I mean, right across the board, it's an interesting question because I think regardless of age or sex, we are seeing common issues at the minute that are actually right across the board. And namely, not new, but actually in a more aggravated way, seeing a lot of anxiety and seeing a lot more variations in mood. And I think that's in part, I think, post-pandemic stuff. I think the state of the world, the state of the economy, there's a lot of stuff going on. And I think in Northern Ireland particularly, I mean, we come with our own unique story anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for years in Northern Ireland, there's always been a lot of unresolved trauma that's never really, there's been a lot of work trying to deal with it. But I think on top of everything else that's going on in the world, we have that part of the story as well. And I think with men, traditionally, what you get is that, every piece of research out there will show us really clearly that men are significantly less likely to go forward if they need help.
Yeah.
And I think in Irish culture as well, there's something about to be struggling or to need help or to need support can be seen as demasculizing or a weakness in some way. And of course, from my point of view, I see it as a complete opposite. To be a human being is to struggle, no matter who you are, no matter what your background, your story, what you've got going on in your life. To be a human being is to struggle. And that means that there are always going to be periods, and sometimes they come unexpectedly, where the mind might feel like it's an overdrive, or anxiety levels might be high, or you just might be feeling really demotivated, or even just a bit hopeless and overwhelmed. And I think men particularly, feel that they shouldn't be feeling that because that's not what it is to be a man, and that shouldn't be happening, when actually it's a very normal thing to be happening. But the difficulty is if you don't reach out, you don't get the right help, you don't talk about this stuff, then it becomes a bigger problem than it needs to be. So I think that would be my key message for any men listening in. If you are struggling, and I guarantee there are many people listening who will be struggling, it doesn't mean that you're a problem, there's anything wrong with you. It just means that you're a human being, but actually knowing how to manage the struggle and maybe knowing when to get help is a really powerful thing.
Do you think the attitude is changing though? Because we're seeing more in the mainstream that conversation is happening more often, that the conversation about mental health, about well-being, we're seeing it more in the mainstream. It's being discussed more. We're seeing it in the papers, we're seeing it on television. So do you think that landscape, that attitude is changing?
I think it's improving, definitely. I think it's
Right.
helped. I mean, I think a lot of celebrities and influencers and generally, we go on to TV, radio or anything now, and we will hear and see people talking about it a lot more. So I think that's a good thing. I guess part of my problem is, like, I'm going to sound like a grumpy old Ardoing man here, but I think part of the problem I've got is that there is a lot of BS out there. I think there is just a lot of top line psychobabble. And I think some of this stuff, you just need to talk. It's never enough. Talking is a hugely important part of this here. But in my work, I talk about change isn't just about having a conversation with somebody. It has to be the right type of conversation. So, for example, if somebody's anxious and they're talking to get reassurance, actually it will keep their anxiety going. If somebody's depressed and they're ruminating over the past over and over and over again, it's the wrong type of talking because it will keep them stuck. So I think how people talk and the right type of talking is crucial, because actually that's what's going to move people forward. But it's not only about the conversations, it's about the people you surround yourself with, your boundaries, how you speak to yourself, how you manage these difficult thoughts in your mind. You know, what do you do with the big emotions and the difficult emotions when they come up. So it's not just, I argue that therapy in itself, and that's what I do. My core training is psychotherapy. A good life isn't about one change. It's just about multiple changes, but often small, that can make an incredible difference. So yeah, it's an incredible start, but it's also about all of the choices that you're making in your life. And even if that's, for me, like if I'm sometimes working with a client and they're completely demotivated or they're feeling hopeless, I'll start and think, if we can just get 5 minutes walk in a day, that's a good start for me.
Yeah.
Or if we can get one phone call, or you just going out for 20 minutes to catch up with a mate, that'll be enough. It doesn't have to be big, extraordinary things. So it's just about those gentle steps at the beginning. And what we know is that actually they can lead to some phenomenal changes. It's just about getting started and understanding the importance of getting started. Why would you talk to somebody? Why is connection important? Why is getting out and about? Why is exercise? We hear this preached to us all of the time, but it's understanding the why. And the why is basically you're changing your brain chemistry and you're helping yourself getting unstuck. So there's always really good scientific evidence for doing all of these things, but often we don't hear about that enough.
Mm. I mean, is there a way of troubleshooting? I mean, we often kind of think, and and I've attended therapy in the past myself, and it was always at the point where I really needed it.
Yeah.
Almost like the black dog was on me before I even knew.
Yeah.
And I think that's very common. I mean, is there a way of kind of, I guess, troubleshooting? I mean, are there signs to look for when you're maybe not in great mental health, or you're maybe slipping under a little bit? Are there things you should look
I
for?
think it's a great question, because I think in the last book I did, I talk about starting your day, checking in on yourself. I describe it like getting into your car. You wouldn't get into your car and just drive off. You just wouldn't. You would get in and you put on your seatbelt and you check your mirrors and you check your fuel. You do all of your checks, because if you don't, you're going to hit a wall, literally, because
Mhm.
it's not safe. And it's the one thing that we don't think about doing. We don't stop and check in and think, right, where am I at the minute? And I think if you do that a bit more often, then you think, God, I'm not sleeping well. I'm thinking day and night. I'm worrying excessively about stuff. I'm agitated. I'm shouting at the kids, the grandkids. I'm not seeing people. I'm not bothered about stuff. I just have lost that sense of motivation. If you start to get those kind of telltale signs that things not be great, then you're looking inwards to think, all right, okay, something needs a bit of adjustment here. So I never see them as bad things. People often get, this is going to sound a bit odd coming from a therapist, but I'm not a big fan of this kind of fairy dust positive thinking,
Mm.
for the sake of positive thinking, because if somebody's in the middle of a really dark episode and they're, you're deeply depressed or grieving or something terrible's going on in their life, it's really hard to go along to somebody and say, oh, you got this and you're good and, just think positive and it's all going to be good. Most people, in my experience, don't buy that. I think it's enough to help people understand, all right, this is a tough time at the minute. So all of these emotions that you might have, even the dark emotions, they're not bad, they're not wrong. Doesn't mean there's a problem. So we shouldn't try and push them away. I see them as like a signpost.
Right.
So if I was working with you and you came to me and you said, oh, I'm feeling a bit rubbish and a bit flat and I can't do this and struggling to sleep and my appetite's going and I'm shouting at people, I'd say, okay, these are really helpful symptoms to look at, because they're telling us, okay, something needs adjusting. Maybe something isn't in balance at the minute. So it gives you then an opportunity to think, all right, okay, well, what's going on with me at the minute? Maybe this stuff has been held down, or maybe there's something that needs changing, or there's something that hasn't been dealt with. So it's kind of like I always go and say, okay, let's look for the benefit here. What can we salvage from this? How can we use even the difficult stuff to use as a barometer to move forward? So I think that's the exciting part about all of this work, is it doesn't have to be dark and heavy. And I think that's the difficulty in the midst of it. When you're going through a tough time, it feels like it's the end of the world and it feels like it's all consuming at the time.
Mm.
But if you can just be a bit open and curious about, all right, maybe this is trying to help me, even though it
Yeah.
feels, pardon my French, but even though it feels absolutely shit when you're in the middle of it, if you can maybe stand back and think, okay, maybe this is trying to tell me something, what changes can I make as a result of this here? Then there's a real opportunity to then think, right, now is the time to start working on this stuff and then moving forward. So, it's not, if for anybody listening today who is having a hard time, even that one thing, I'd encourage you to think about that maybe this isn't a bad thing. If it encourages you to stop and take a look and reevaluate and make a couple of changes, then actually this maybe needs to be happening at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, do you think there's something in, I mean, before you kind of go and seek help? I mean, I've had counseling in various forms over the years. Some worked for me, some didn't.
Yeah,
Some I just, when I got kind of partly down the road, I was like, this isn't for me. This isn't working.
absolutely.
This is nonsense. And not that it was nonsense, it just was not working for
No,
me.
no, I get it.
I mean, so do you think it's sort of advisable for people to sort of do a bit of research of this is what this entails, this is what this is going to,
I think if you're going to go for a bit of help, and here's the thing, not everybody, there's a real difference between mental ill health and mental well-being. And I think that conversation's got really confused at the moment because everyone's hashtagging mental health and everyone has mental health now, which is true because we're human beings. Of course, we all have mental health. I think there's a danger that it's just becoming a concept that's been used to describe everything. And I argue waking up having a bad day doesn't mean you have a mental health disorder. It just means you're a human being. Or having a period of anxiety doesn't mean that there's necessarily a big problem. So I guess my point is I think there's a danger that we end up over pathologizing people, but at the same time, you still want to keep the conversations open. But, as a general rule, I think if the bad days are outnumbering the good days, over certainly a couple of weeks, a couple of months, that's always a really good indicator. Okay, now is the time to just reach out and get a bit of help. I think finding the right person is really important. As a therapist, we have to have therapy. It's part of the deal. And I've had therapists over the years that just categorically didn't work. I've had therapists that work brilliantly with me. So I think it's about, I need people who are very down to earth, very open, no bullshit, straight talking. That's what works for me. So I think you have to find the right person. If it's a bit too woo-woo or it's a bit too airy-fairy, it might put somebody off, depending on the therapist style. So I think a recommendation is always good. And actually finding the right type of therapy, for example, for anxiety, for example, or any of the anxiety. I don't like the word disorders, but I'm just going to say it because it's, it's kind of how we know it professionally. So for anxiety disorders, we know that cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, is probably the best evidence treatment. So if you need help with anxiety, finding a good CBT, cognitive behavioral therapist, is probably a step in the right direction because they target it. If you're working on trauma, again, generic counseling for trauma, even though it might be helpful to go and offload. If someone's got genuine PTSD, again, they might want to go for a more specific intervention that knows how to work specifically with processing trauma rather than just going along for a weekly chat. Because I guess the difficulty is that, and I say this unapologetically, and some therapists may not like this, but if therapy just becomes a chat, then it's not going to be effective. Because you can have a chat with anyone. You can go down to the pub with your mate and have a chat and offload and splurge and just chat, talk to the cows come home. You might feel a bit better short term because you've got stuff off your chest. There's nothing wrong with that. But actually, if you want to move forward and break through and kind of, reclaim your life in some way, sometimes just having a chat isn't enough. There has to be focus. There has to be dealing with the stuff. There has to be and knowing what you want, what direction you see things going. And more importantly, this is the part that people struggle with. You have to be willing to take responsibility that the therapist isn't going to do the work for you. We all have to dig deep and find, all right, okay, ultimately it's me that's going to have to do the work here. And I see it all the time with clients. They resist that a bit and they get a bit annoyed because they think you're going to kind of magic go on their life and make it all better. And it's like, no, you're going to do the work. Kind of like if I'm working with a guy and he's out in the piss 7 nights a week, and he's not taking any responsibility for his life. And he comes to therapy and he's like, okay, you're going to make me better. And I'm saying, well, that ain't going to happen unless you start making decisions about, the actions and behaviors in your life that don't serve you well. So it is I don't like that expression, manning up, but sometimes it is about having some really difficult conversations about, okay, here's the deal, but what are you going to do?
Yeah.
What's your part in all of this here? So, I think, if you're thinking about going for a therapist, don't look for a fluffy therapist that's going to pat you on the shoulder and say, oh, poor you, it's all terrible. There's a time and a place for that. And there's a time and a place for compassionate therapy, but don't be afraid to go for someone who's going to make you feel a bit uncomfortable and push you a bit.
Yeah, because these are not easy fixes or quick fixes. It can often
They're
be quite.
not.
I always I found it was there were either things that were sort of almost like a sort of a sticking plaster, like a temporary measure. Then there were other things I went down which were kind of long-term things, and they were very, very different approaches. Very different
Absolutely.
approaches.
Yeah.
But it was difficult to identify which. Took me a while to identify which was actually working better for me.
Yeah, no, it's good. Look, I think there is something quite simple about it. I think most people, when they're struggling in their everyday life, like it's this time of the year, people are out, doing Christmas shopping and various bits and bobs, and people are busy. And you often watch people getting irritated or losing their temper or getting wound up. Now, more than often, yeah, there's people are stressed and a bit overwhelmed this time of the year. But what you often find is most people get activated, in the here and now, often about stuff that's happened 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Hmm.
It just gets reawakened. So I think there is a real value in understanding your story. What's the stuff that winds you up? So, for example, if you come from a background where there wasn't a lot of love and affection, or you weren't allowed to express emotion, or your parents weren't around a lot, there was neglect, or whatever the context might be, will that impact in your adult life? Of course it will. But for me, it's never about getting stuck there, because you can't, you can use your story, but you can't change it. So I think it's always like, I know as a human being, I know what pushes my buttons. I know what winds me up. I know when my stuff gets triggered.
Yeah.
And often if I feel it coming up, I often know this has got nothing to do with what's happening to me now. This is 40 years. This is 40 years back stuff that's been activated. But as long as you know that, you can do something about it. So I think in some ways it's pretty straightforward. Just get to know your story and get to know who you are and why you are who you are, and why
Yeah.
you react the way you do. But on a day-to-day stuff, I think often it's about, okay, what are the sort of, I describe these as like micro injections. What are the small things that you can, include in your day that significantly make a difference? And often they are quite simple. And in my experience, it's the small things like, connection with people. I think loneliness is one of the biggest, understated symptoms when it comes to depression. We don't talk about that. It's rarely even mentioned as a symptom, yet I think a lot of people are lonely.
Yeah.
But when you start connecting a bit, you end up feeling better. Every piece of science tells us a bit of exercise within your capability is mega helpful, because it increases your serotonin uptake, which is one of the feel-good chemicals. So that in itself can work. The foods we put into your body, if we're eating a load of crap, we're eating high fat, high sugary stuff, it's going to increase the inflammation in our body. I argue that anxiety is an inflammatory state. So if you even think about that, these simple things in itself, if you're keeping an eye on what you're eating, if you're keeping an eye on your exercise, if you're getting out and about a little bit and connecting with people, these are like hugely, honestly, the changes that these can make, even in 2 weeks for people, you can see astronomical changes. So I think there's a danger sometimes that our profession and people in my industry, we can make this seem very complicated and difficult and scary almost, when actually it's not. It's just it's finding ways to kind of navigate our way through. And once you get started in that path and you realize, okay, this is doable, then suddenly you notice a bit of a spring in your step and your mood starting to improve and the thoughts in the head starting to quieten a bit. And that's liberating. And that's why I love what I do, because, I guess I see people coming, and they come at the beginning and they're exhausted and they're knackered and they're a bit hopeless and things just feel a bit much. And I love watching the progress of somebody then starting to get their life back, and then finding that spark, and then it returning, and then suddenly, that's the joy in this work, really. So when I see somebody coming in at the beginning and they might feel utterly hopeless, I guess from my point, I have a contract with everyone I work with, and my only contract, my agreement with them is that if they're not feeling optimistic or hopeful that things can improve at the minute, the only thing I ask them to do is to allow me to hold on to the hope at the beginning, with an agreement that as we progress and as we work, that they will allow me bit by bit to hand it over to them.
Mm.
And I've never once had a client reject that as a contract. If you're
An
not,
amazing concept. It's an amazing concept, that. Yeah.
It's how I work, and it's I've never once had someone push back. So if a guy comes into me and he said, I don't see the point in anything, it just all utterly feels pointless, I'll say that's fine. I've heard this a million times. The only thing I ask is I don't believe that to be true, and I believe this can be much better than it is today. So the only agreement I want is, will you let me hold that for now? But bit by bit, when you're ready, can I start handing bits over?
Mm.
And then they're like, okay. And then we get started, and then we build it up. So it's never about forcing it on somebody, or telling them that they should be feeling different, or shaming them into feeling. This is my problem with positive thinking, for the sake of positive thinking. I think it can shame people into believing that they should be feeling better than they are. When actually, if you're in the throes of grief, you're in the throes of grief. That's how it should be. That's the price of loving someone when you're in the throes of grief. It's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean that you stay there forever or that you get stuck, but actually it's not about shaming the emotion, or if you're isolated because you've had a breakup, or you've been made redundant, or you had health issues that you're really battling with stuff. That's all right to have dark moments and dark days, but it's not about shaming people into thinking you must feel better today, get your act together.
Yeah.
So, no, I get this, but let's work on reframing it, and let's work on, see if we can look at this through a different lens on what one next step would help. For most people, that's incredibly valuable.
Let's take a short break there and head over to the doctor's surgery for a reminder about some ways we can be a little bit healthier.
I'm Dr. Alan Stout, and I'm a GP. If I can share one thing, it's this. I see far too many men coming in too late. If men would just get checked out by a doctor a bit sooner, I know for sure that lives could be saved and men's health improved. So I'm going to share some of the things men should look out for and why they matter, and most importantly, what to do about them. Today we're going to be talking about some of the more awkward topics, including prostate cancer and bowel cancer. These two, along with lung cancer, are the three big C's affecting men in Northern Ireland after skin cancer, which I've talked about in another episode. So the first thing to say is that as a GP, please don't be shy about these things. There's nothing we haven't seen or heard before. Getting checked is never a waste of anyone's time, and it could save your life. Before we get into the big three, I'll also quickly mention testicular cancer. Testicular cancer is relatively rare in men over 50. It usually begins as a painless lump in the testicle. It's diagnosed through blood tests to detect certain hormones in your blood, and early detection and treatment are highly successful in curing this cancer, so do see your GP if you find any sort of a lump. So while we're down there, let's talk about prostate cancer as well. This is the most prevalent cancer amongst men. The prostate is a small gland in the pelvis and is part of the male reproductive system. It's about the size of a walnut and is located between the penis and the bladder, and surrounds the tube that carries urine from the bladder out of the penis, which is called the urethra. Symptoms don't usually appear until the prostate is large enough to affect that tube, and when this happens, you may notice things such as an increased need to pee, straining whilst you try and pee, a feeling that your bladder has not fully emptied. These symptoms should not be ignored. They do not mean that you have prostate cancer. Some commonly used tests for prostate cancer are a physical examination of your prostate, which is also known as a digital rectal examination, or DRE, and also a blood test called PSA, which is the prostate specific antigen. These might be followed by an MRI scan. Again, early detection and diagnosis are key, and sometimes prostate cancer may not need treatment, but instead just keeping an eye on it, as it can be very slow to progress. Don't delay getting checked out if something isn't right with your waterworks. The next big C is bowel cancer or colorectal cancer, and common symptoms to look out for are changes in the bowel habit and any blood in the stool or abdominal discomfort. Again, the key is early detection and treatment, and not being shy about talking about your bowels. Don't wait to get these symptoms checked. If you're over 60, you will automatically be sent a bowel cancer screening test, and so please don't ignore this. Scoop the poop and post it back. It's a moment in time for much longer term peace of mind. And the final of the big three C's is lung cancer. Although it's often linked to smoking, non-smokers can also develop this disease. Early symptoms may be very subtle, but as persistent cough, chest pain, or difficulty breathing are common signs. And again, please get these checked out if they continue. With all of these, don't ignore your body's early warning signs and do know what's normal for you. If something looks or feels unusual, remember you're in charge. In most cases, it won't be cancer, but it's always best to get checked by your doctor. You're far more likely to survive cancer if you spot it early and act fast.
Age NI's Good Vibrations programme is for men over 50. If you or someone you know could use some advice or support on health, well-being or mental health, there's lots more information online at ageni.org/iConnect. That's letter I, CONNECT. Or visit ageni.org/good vibrations to sign up for monthly emails with expert tips and information. Remember, it's okay not to feel okay. The Age NI Good Vibrations team are here with help and support.
I'm very acutely aware of my emotions a lot of the time. That when I'm having a low day, I go, I'm having a low day. And if I've arranged to meet somebody and I can't really face it, the people around me are kind of open enough that I can text them and go, do you know something? I don't really think I can do this today. I'm just going to watch a few movies, whatever, or listen to records and shit, whatever. And things like that. When I'm aware when I have a low day, I'm having a low day, but I'm also aware when I have a good day or a high day or whatever. Yeah. And there are certain things I think people have more understanding of than others. We understand when people feel down about grief, or they feel down, as you say, about a breakup or something like that. But there are other things that I think people have more difficult to understand, like anxiety, because anxiety is essentially the worry about something that hasn't happened. And I think people have difficulty understanding that sometimes.
Absolutely. And
I find it difficult to understand why I feel anxiety about something that hasn't happened,
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. This is going to sound really odd. It's not actually you. And that's the key thing about anxiety. So you're experiencing it, but you're not the anxiety. So anxiety is a fascinating one. I mean, trauma and anxiety are my two areas of interest. And what most people fail to realize with anxiety is that, firstly, I should premise, anxiety is an intolerance of uncertainty. So if you look at a textbook example of anxiety, most of them will say it's an intolerance of uncertainty. So there's a real clue in the title there. If you're intolerant of things being uncertain, then you're going to struggle. We're actually learning to be a bit more tolerant, if not knowing, and taking things one step at a time is really powerful. But without boring you with the science too much, you've got a part in your brain on the right-hand side called the amygdala. It's like a fire alarm. And it's useful. It's like a threat system. So if someone run into your room today and threatened you, your amygdala would be stimulated straight away. So it would be like a fire alarm going off, telling you there's threat and there's danger, get out of the room. And that would be an appropriate anxiety response. So anxiety is a really useful thing. Now, I want to talk about, I think this is such an important part of this conversation because I wholeheartedly believe that there's a lot of Northern Ireland populations, particularly 50, people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, people who grew up in the heart of the Troubles when they lived in threatened environments every day of their lives. And it became very normal. So if you think about the context of that, you got a brain that's primarily hardwired to look out for threat and danger. Now, even though the threat and danger may well have long passed, what can happen is that for no reason, or sometimes even for a trigger that you may not be aware of, or sometimes it doesn't even need to be a specific trigger, the brain can basically go into a state of alarm and the amygdala gets activated. So it's really confusing because the body then goes into a state of threat and into a state of alarm, looking out for danger. So that's why we feel uptight. That's why the heart's beating. That's why chest might feel a bit tight. It might be there's a sense of doom around or a sense of worry, but not quite sure what the worry's about. So when I'm working with people, it always starts with the body because initially anxiety for most people will start as a state of alarm in the body. And when you teach people that it's just, think of it like a fire alarm that's just gone off when it doesn't need to, that's all that's happening with anxiety. So when you recognize that, you can then deactivate it in the body. I teach people various techniques, how do you slow that anxiety down? How do you reduce the volume a bit so that it doesn't feel as overwhelming? Because when you do that, that will send a message to the brain to say, okay, because the brain then, when it detects a state of alarm, will then start to think, what's the problem? So if there's no one running into the room to attack you, or there's no terrible threat, the brain then starts to create stories about, well, there must be a problem. So it will then start to create stories. What if? What if? What if? So that's why we then go into overthinking and worry, because the brain's trying to find a narrative that matches the state of threat in the body.
Right.
So often with unresolved trauma or people who have grown up in states of threat, what they'll find is sometimes they just get this state of anxiety that's moved in because it's so primarily hardwired. And because it's hard to make sense of it, then the brain starts to create stories. And then people start worrying about their future, their health, money, what might happen. The human brain's an incredible storyteller. But the interesting thing is 90% of what we worry about in this lifetime will never come to anything. We know that from the neuroscience. And most of these thoughts that you have in your head, the what ifs or the interrogatory, persecutory voice, you're rubbish, you're shit, you're not good enough, you're a failure, they are just patterns, they're just thoughts, they're not facts. But most people relate to them like it's a truth and like it's a fact.
Yeah.
And that's a skill in all of this here, learning to turn the volume down and learning to step back a bit and think it's just a thought. I don't need to.
I think you're right. I do think there's a lot of stuff that did remain unchecked with us as a generation here in Northern Ireland. Like you and I are around the same age, and we're both from North Belfast.
Yeah.
You're from Ardoyne, I'm from New Lodge, and I only in my later years did I realize that a lot of the stuff that I kind of normalized in my head was ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like if you tell somebody from another country, oh yeah, we used to get searched every day
Yeah.
by the army or police, and they're like, what? And you
Yeah.
go, yeah, what age? I think, what age are you? Oh, about 12. So they searched your school bag. Yeah, yeah. And we just kind of thought this was normal. I mean, did you find that, as you were training more as a psychotherapist, and did it make you look back and go, I went through some serious stuff back then that I've kind of left unchecked here that I need to really.
It's a good point, because it's come up in different ways for me over the years. I think you're right, Joe. I think we learned to normalize it, and it was a case of survival. Anxiety, you're often talking about fight or flight. And I think if you look up the whole dynamics of what happened in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, there was a lot of fighting and there was a lot of flighting. There was also a lot of freezing going on as well. There were moments when people almost felt paralyzed, but they just kind of were frozen with fear. And I think the normalization of it was a way of surviving, because it's the only way you can survive getting through that adversity. You've got to normalize it, because otherwise it becomes too overwhelming. But I noticed things when I first moved to London. I remember it being an issue. You don't think about it too much, do you? When you're there, you don't. I didn't think about it at all, and therapy wasn't a thing. And I remember when I first moved to London, I was in a show one night. I went to see a show with a couple of mates, and something happened. I can't even remember if it was in the theatre or outside, but this sudden bang happened unexpectedly, and my immediate instinct was to go down on the floor. I mean, it was a loud bang. It was really unexpected. And my mates in London at the time thought this was the funniest thing ever, because none of them flinched. It was such a and I still, like, to this day, a car backfires loudly. There will always be an instinctive, mile or half from London laughs every time, thinks it's funny, because I would always jump if a car backfires. But it's so primarily hardwired to react when a bang goes off. I think I understand why that is. But
is that still the case for you? You still, if you hear,
I know what it is, but if a loud bang goes off unexpectedly, it will still always.
I still do. There are certain habits I've picked up. Like when I was a teenager and started going out, I would never, if I got a taxi from town, I would never get the taxi to my door.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Do you know what I mean? Because I would get it somewhere that was kind of a neutral area, because you know what it was like back then.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I still do that. I don't get a taxi to my front door.
It's incredible the things we
still do that.
One thing I was talking about this when I was writing the last book. I very often as a kid, particularly during the riots, I learned to go asleep with my fingers on my ears. Particularly when the riots were bad, I just learned to quieten, because we were in Ardoyne and we were in the, basically just behind the shops are at Ardoyne. So we were always when a riot happened, we were in the middle of this. There was no getting away from it. And I kind of learned this skill of just, I remember once a bullet coming through. Myself and one of my brothers slept in the attic, and I remember a bullet. There was a gun battle going on. A bullet came through the loft window in the bedroom, and another time I remember a plastic bullet coming through the living room window when we were sitting watching telly. So I mean, it's stuff that when you talk about out loud, you think that sounds exaggerated or crazy, but it was all very real stuff. So I learned to sleep with my fingers on my ears, and I'd done it for years. And a couple of years ago, we went off to South Africa or something on holiday, And I always wore earplugs. And we were doing safari, and we were basically in the arsehole of nowhere on the safari. And I got there and I realized I'd forgotten my earplugs, which I'd always worn. And I noticed this immediate sense of panic that I didn't have my earplugs with me.
Wow.
Another half was like, that's all right. It's no problem. We're on holiday. It's quiet and not be bothered. And then I said, yeah, I'm sure it'll be all right. And then suddenly went to bed. And this had never happened before because it's just so habitual. Went to bed, no earplugs, and suddenly realized I feel really anxious because I didn't have that. And I had the instinct was to want to put my fingers in my ears. And I thought I hadn't clocked at that for years. I think I like a good night's sleep. But the earplugs was it was just a way, just an old thing, just an old way of blocking out noise. So I think that, these are, I mean, there are 100 of examples I'm sure we could all give, but I think this is such an important part of this conversation because we all grew up in this, and it didn't matter what side of the divide you were on. We were just growing up in this constant state of threat and uncertainty and not knowing. So it would be impossible to be an adult, or you can't really go into adult life and not have residual stuff knocking around in the background. And I think apart from everything else and all the everyday stresses of everyday life, every time I do a talk back in Northern Ireland, I always say that we can't exclude the uniqueness of the situation here. We didn't grow up in the UK. We didn't grow up in other parts of Europe where this wasn't happening in this way. So you have to include that as part of the understanding why people might struggle and why our statistics are higher than other parts of Europe. Why are our suicide rates higher than other parts of Europe? Why are our mental health? So we look at these and people ask a lot of questions about it. And I don't think it's a question that we need to deep dive into. It makes total sense to me that we would have statistics that are higher. It makes total sense to me that we should have resources that are aware of this. I mean, call a spade here. I mean, resources are appalling in Northern Ireland. In the UK generally, I mean, we haven't got enough mental health provision. I mean, that is unapologetically, that in itself needs a proper looking at. But, when we look at, we don't need the evidence to show us really. I mean, we have studies and we've got a lot of there's great people doing work pointing this out, but we need more resources. We need more professionals who know what to do and know how to go in and reach out to people and get them through this here. So I think that lobbying and that people having a voice and speaking out is also really, really important, because it couldn't be any other way. But we have to always think about when there's been years and years and years of trauma, you can't expect it to vanish, because then there's going to be years and years and years of residual trauma. And that gets passed on. I mean, you've heard the transgenerational trauma stuff, but if people of our generation haven't dealt with their stuff, that's within the family unit. That anxiety then becomes part of the family anxiety. And people who haven't grown up in the troubles then start to experience anxiety because they're part of a unit. So it's, it goes on and on and on until we address the fact, no, at some point this has to be dealt with. And at some point we have to look at all of this here. It always astounds me actually that we never, when it comes to troubles in Northern Ireland, we look at everything, don't we? We look at all of the stories, and we look at the reasons, and we look at both sides, and we understand why the conflict happened, and we understand the views on both sides. But the thing we never really look at in detail is that we never really look at the psychological states of people on both sides, which was largely about this psychological inflexibility. We're wrong, we're right, you're wrong. And that happened on both sides. And that psychological inflexibility, where it was a fixed belief, we are the wrong party, you're the bad people, that locked state was such a big part of the problem, and it never really got tackled. So people looked at history, they looked at the sociology, they looked at the politicians, they were looking at all of this, but nobody was looking at people's psychological state. And to this day, it astounds me that when you go to conferences or you see documentaries on trauma, I think, God, can we please start talking about the fact that when you have a psychological state that becomes locked and fixed and held with these beliefs that you're the wronged and you're the victimized, then it's really difficult to move forward from that. The work has to be about helping people psychologically move to a point of fluidity and openness and compromise and all of that stuff, because that flexibility, I think, is what's going to bring people forward. And I think it's my view, it's not a collective view, but that's when kind of true peace happens, actually, when we can live in psychological flexibility together and truly be able to hear the other person and truly be able to have an opinion and a voice without betraying, or truly being able to live somewhere without needing to get out of the taxi at the other end of the road.
Yeah. It's just, it's just a habit. I actually can't explain it. People, and it only
No, I get it. I get it.
I didn't even know until somebody pointed it out to me. And they said, "Why do you never go straight to your door?" And I just went, "Well," and when I explained it, and I said, "But that was like, because then I moved up the coast. I studied up in Korean for 40 years, and I kind of moved into student land after that. And then, so it was that, but I still did it, and I still do it, and I probably will always do it.
Yeah.
It's just something that sort of developed there,
But
And
I bet you everyone listening today, I bet you every guy listening to this today will have a similar,
yeah,
they'll have a similar quirk of some description that was part of their safety behavior
yeah.
at
But
the
the
time.
problem now is getting a taxi in Belfast. You've not been that.
You can't get one now.
Getting taxis in Belfast
I-
is an issue right now.
I was overseeing my dad a few weeks ago, and it was a nightmare because I stay in town so I can see more people rather than
Yeah.
jolting around everywhere. But it was a nightmare getting back and forward to see people.
It's like getting the last chopper out of Saigon. It's ridiculous. You know what I mean? Owen, listen, thank you very much for speaking to us. It's been a
You're
real
welcome, Joe. I hope that's
pleasure
been helpful.
and an amazing conversation. Thank you. And you're doing God's work. You're on the side of the angels, my friend. And thank you very much.
It's my pleasure, and I wish you well with this campaign and all you're doing. I'm sure there's many people listening and looking at the stuff that hopefully get real benefit from. So best of luck with it all, and thank you for taking the time to speak to me.
AGNI are the local experts on later life. If you or someone you know is struggling to navigate the challenges of life after 50 and need information or advice on benefit entitlements, housing, or care for a loved one, call the AGNI advice line in confidence 9 to 5, Monday to Friday on 0808 808 75 75.
That's it for this episode of How's the Form. Hope you'll join us next time.
How's the Forum is brought to you by AGNI and is part of the Good Vibrations Over 50s Men's Health Programme, which is funded by Movember.